If you find yourself standing before the chopping block of history, you face a terrifying choice. If the only way to survive is to erase the very existence of your sons from the imperial records, would you dare to pick up the brush? Look closely at this document. It is a sickly, withered yellow, its edges frayed by 1,000 years of desperate hands. In the year 702, in the province of Me, no, this was more than a census. It was a death warrant signed in ink. In the archives of the Shogunate Treasury, there is a secret that should not exist, a scroll known as the Taiho Year 2 registry. In this village, the records show a world that defies nature. A land of women. The ratio of females to males is nearly 10 to 1. On paper, it is a peaceful sanctuary. In reality, it is a graveyard of identities, a massive fraud designed to cheat a cold, calculating empire. The central figure of this deception is a man known as Master Qin. Master Qin was no professional swindler. In an age of gods and absolute law, forging an imperial document was a slow suicide, but he was a man trapped. He was a small gear in the crushing machinery of the Ritsu Ryo system, a massive revenue engine imported from the mainland. To the bureaucrats in the capital of Nara, life was not sacred. It was a data point, a tax code. They called it the CE, iti the adult male. Once you were marked as a male between the ages of 21 and 60, you became high-value fuel for the imperial furnace. Consider the bill presented to Master Qin. First, the land tax, the so, a fixed portion of his harvest, regardless of drought or locusts. If the earth failed, the debt remained. Second, the tribute, the chow. This was the organized theft of local craft. No was famous for its silk. Master Qin's wife and daughters spent their lives in the shadows weaving high-grade fabrics for the flowing robes of distant nobles. They worked until their fingers bled to clothe a court they would never see. But the deadliest was the the labor tax. This was the state claiming ownership of the male body. As a C&E, Master Qin's sons were liable to be dragged thousands of miles to the capital. They were forced to build towering pagodas and hollow bronze giants under the lash. No food was provided, no protection. Many died on the roadside before they even reached the construction sites. To the empire, a man was a consumable asset. Use him until he breaks, then find another. Master Qin watched his sons grow. He felt no pride, only terror. Every inch of height and every ounce of muscle was a countdown to their disappearance into the imperial military or the labor camps. Growth was not a blessing. It was a walk toward the altar of sacrifice. In the dead of night, the village headman came to his door. He was no savior. He was a middle manager pushed to the brink by impossible quotas. If Master Qin's family fled to the mountains, the headman would be held liable for their debt. In the flickering candlelight, the headman whispered a deal of mutual survival. If the state only harvests men, then let the men vanish. Master Qin took the brush. His hand trembled as if it held a heavy plow. He looked at his sleeping boys, then at the registry. With a few strokes, he performed an administrative self-mutilation in the column for gender. He erased his sons. He wrote the character for female with that single drop of ink. His sons became his eldest and second daughters. This virus of deception spread. Neighbors became a silent brotherhood of ghosts. In the reports sent to the capital, the men of Me had succumbed to a supernatural plague of disappearance. The village was now a thriving land of women on paper, but the lie became a cage. The state, finding its fuel supply low, began to squeeze the woman for compensatory taxes. Master Chin's sons were forced to live as phantoms. They could not farm in the daylight. They could not speak aloud. They could never marry or father children. For every new life was a hole in the ledger that could not be patched. They had hacked the system, but the system had hollowed out their lives. Then, the dust rose on the horizon. The Imperial Inspector had arrived. He brought soldiers and steel. He brought a final audit of the flesh. The time for ink was over. The time for blood had begun. As the cold iron stirrups of the inspector's horse entered the village, Master Chin knew his canopy of ink was about to be shredded by raw violence. The inspector did not come to ask questions. He brought the baimo, the brutal physical audit. He ordered every female in the village to gather at the threshing floor for a face-to-face interrogation. This was the final trial of flesh against paper. If the registry said maiden, but the person who stepped forward had broad shoulders, heavy joints, and a visible Adam's apple. The verdict was immediate: heavy shackles, public flogging, or a death sentence. Master Chin watched the scrolls being unrolled and realized the administrative lie had reached its breaking point. He did not wait for the verdict. That night, he set his own thatched hut ablaze. In the towering flames, he led his family into the pitch-black depths of the primeval forest in ancient times. This was Futu the Floating Flight. It was more than an escape. It was a social suicide. They had uninstalled their identities from the Imperial database. They were now outlaws, non-people. Ghost labor in a land that demanded every drop of blood. But this was not the end. It was the birth of a new power dynamic. Master Chin's family did not become savages in the woods. They crossed the wilderness and sought refuge in a shuan, a private estate. The master of this land was a powerful provincial tycoon. These lords were often nobles or high officials who sensed that the imperial system was hemorrhaging to death because of tax evaders like Master Chin. They used their influence to seize vast tracts of land and offered a deal the refugees could not refuse. Give me your labor, and I will give you a life out the law. Master Chin and his sons became hidden households. On paper, they still did not exist. They were even more lowly than before. But in reality, they finally reclaimed their manhood. They no longer had to pretend to be women. They picked up heavy tools, and eventually longbows and steel blades to defend the Lord's private lands from the imperial tax collectors. The irony was absolute. Master Chin had escaped the state's tax, only to become a private asset of a local warlord. This concentration of black market labor gave provincial lords a wealth and military power that rivaled the capital. By the 9th century, the data collapse had triggered a national chain reaction. The court in the capital found its treasuries filled with useless scrolls of female names, while in the real world, the men had vanished into the estates of the tycoons. The state had become financially anemic. It could no longer afford a standing army, because on paper, the men of the nation had simply disappeared. The Ritsu-Ryo system was dying of its own rigid logic. When the central government lost its monopoly on violence, the tycoons began to professionalize their hidden forces. The grandsons of Master Chin grew up in these estates. They were no longer humble farmers. They were the sharpest tools of the Lord. They trained not in planting, but in horsemanship and slaughter, because they had no legal registry. Their only survival was the steel in their hands. This is the blood-soaked truth of the samurai class. They were not born for honor. They were born to protect the private interests grown from fraudulent data. They were the physical manifestation of the state's failed algorithm. When the descendants of Master Qin donned their armor and rode back into their ancestral villages, the once mighty imperial officials were nothing but lambs for the slaughter. The warriors realized that if the state was built on scrap paper, then power belonged to the blade that could cut through bone. In the late 1190s, when Minamoto no Yoritomo established the first Bakufu, the Shogunate, the 400-year gamble, reached its final loop. The Shogunate was not just a military government, it was the ultimate alliance of these local armed landlords. The descendants of the liars and their protectors had finally seized the final word. They kicked aside the Nara bureaucrats and established a new order based on physical land ownership and military service, not empty population counts. History leaves us with a massive irony. In the Shosoin treasury, the Tai Hoyer II registry has been preserved for 1,300 years. It is a fake invoice frozen in time, a testament to a land of women that never truly was. We are told heroes make history, but if you dig into the roots, you will find the first domino was pushed by a man like Master Qin. Trembling in the candlelight, trying to turn his sons into daughters. When a regime tries to simplify living souls into numbers on a ledger, those numbers will eventually turn into the steel that pierces its heart. Master Qin died in the furrows of a nameless field. His children forgot the village of me. No, but the ink he spilled 4 centuries earlier became the storm that tore the old world apart. Even now, in the silence of the treasury, if you look at those rows of the word female, you can still hear the faint, desperate sigh of a man who broke an empire just to keep his family alive.